Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I reached the switchback where the cracked service road disappeared under alder branches and winter-faded grass, killed the engine, and let the silence settle. The tower stood 200 yards upslope, thin steel in a ragged triangle, guy-wired into shallow bedrock, a red beacon dead in daylight. It was a county emergency broadcast site I remembered from volunteer work with the amateur radio club years ago, a place where technicians came once a year to test batteries and start the generator. After the world changed, the diesel truck never came again. My wagon door creaked. I kept my movement quiet and slow. There were no voices in the trees, only the distant rush of the river in the bottom of the Bitterroot Valley, and the dry rattle of a loose chain on the fence. I had parked beneath a broken "No Public Access" sign whose letters had faded to a pale gray. The yellow gate hung twisted, bent out of shape by an old impact. I took the bolt cutters from the back of the wagon anyway and snipped the chain as a formality, coiled it, and set it behind the post. The infected were drawn to vibration and continuous sound. I had learned that by watching them react to idling engines and loose shutters. I had learned it the way you learn that ice is slick, by slipping. The hill was steep. I climbed with my pack shouldered and my hands on the rough bark of wind-stunted pines, pausing at the top to check the greenhouse-style cabinet that housed the transfer switch. A county inventory label still clung to the metal. Ravalli County Emergency Services, Site 4, Ward Mountain. The key box was open. The key was gone. The padlock on the door had been cut years ago, left hanging as if it still did a job. Inside, mice had shredded the foam weather seal and turned it into a small nest behind the breaker panel. My gloves lifted dust and dry scat. The cabinet smelled like old ozone and a summer storm. I pulled the door to the equipment shelter. The jamb had been pried, but not enough. I wedged the screwdriver against the hasp and leaned on it with my shoulder until the screws stripped and the hasp tore free. Inside, stale air pushed at my face. Fluorescent lights were dark. A daylight window the size of a clipboard let in a rectangle of sun. A rack of old VHF repeaters glowed a faint red from a single, still-alive status LED, powered by an uninterruptible supply that should have died months ago, but was perhaps resting at a trickle from the solar panel I saw on the roof edge. I said my name softly, then switched to habits formed when amateur radio was a hobby rather than a survival tool. Entering the equipment room, I said aloud, part of an imaginary maintenance log. Talking kept my breathing slow. It made me mark things instead of rushing. Everything vital was here. The rack, the coaxial cables labeled in neat heat shrink, the lightning arresters bolted to a copper-ground bar, the hole in the floor where a coax line went to a buried conduit up the tower leg, and in the back corner a diesel generator with a faded manufacturer plate that read, Kohler 20 kW diesel, standby. The day tank gauge sat at a quarter. On the wall above a clipboard, monthly test run, January, February. The last entry was 3 years ago, a technician's initials and a quick note that the battery charger fault light had flickered. The charger now sat dark. I kept my backpack on the chair, county property turned to my property by abandonment, and took out the tools I had. A multimeter, a headlamp, a length of copper strap with 2 whole lugs, a roll of self-vulcanizing tape, and a notebook. I laid everything out with the same care you give to food in lean times. Then I walked the room. The batteries were in a gray steel cabinet, 2 banks of 6-volt absorbed glass mat batteries wired in series parallel for 24 volts. I tested one, 11.9 volts at the halfway tap, low but alive. The charger was off because the breaker in the transfer switch was down. The line from the hydro feed on the valley floor had been down since spring. The generator was the only option. I bled the fuel filter into a jar, no water. The fuel smelled good, diesel like it should, not algae sour. I checked the oil. It was near the top mark, dark but not gritty. I checked the coolant in the small plastic tank that fed the radiator. Green and full. I followed the flexible exhaust to where it went through the wall into a baffled box. The box had a mesh that had collected a bird nest. I cleaned it gently until the passage was open. I put the intake lever on run, pressed the prime until my thumb ached, and said a simple sentence to the empty room. "Let's see if you still want to work." Then I pressed start. The engine rotated twice, stopped, rotated again, and caught. Diesel thrum filled the concrete box and settled into a steady pace. The floor vibrated. The clipboard hook on the wall rang like a fork tapped against a glass. I watched the panel meters come alive. Oil pressure up, frequency stable near 60 Hz, voltage where it belonged. I turned the transfer switch. The room changed tone. Fluorescent lights flickered, buzzed, and held. On the rack, status lights marched from red to green, one by one, as though the hardware debated waking up and then decided to say hello. I kept the engine under observation for 10 minutes. Exhaust heat warmed the wall. Coolant temperature came up and stabilized. There were no leaks. A smell of hot dust burned off the generator housing and drifted out the cracked shelter door. I wrote numbers into my notebook. Oil pressure, coolant temp, frequency, voltage. Then I pulled a rag over my mouth and took the broom around the concrete to knock spider webs away from the corners and send ants elsewhere. It felt ceremonial because it was. I did not open the outside door until the generator had run 30 minutes without a hiccup. When I did, I stepped into clean autumn air and stood listening. The tower wires vibrated with a faint sound that you only hear when you are up close to metal that is under steady tension in a breeze. The guy anchors were shallow, set into cracked granite with epoxy. The turnbuckles were rusted and tight. I checked each with a wrench and marked the ones that accepted a quarter turn. A lightning arrestor cable run to a copper rod had come loose. I fixed it with the strap and 2 stainless bolts. From the top platform 80 feet up, 2 VHF folded dipoles hung on either side, their coax lines wrapped in tape cracked from ultraviolet light. I taped the cracks and made a short note to replace the tape with heat shrink when I had time and heat. Through the pines, the valley opened. Hamilton to the south, Stevensville north. The river like a worn strip of silver tape. I could see roofs and streets. At night, those had been dark. But I had seen small lights move sometimes, hard to tell what made them. Lanterns, headlamps, fires that started then dimmed. People or things that were once people followed sound and regular motion. I had watched them gather at chain-link fences when wind made the posts hum. I went back inside. I flipped the main breaker for the equipment rack. The VHF repeater, a unit with a 20-year-old front panel, came alive with a tone. Then a short burst from an attached weather receiver that tried to acquire a signal and failed. Beneath it, a UHF link radio showed a channel number. I checked coax connections and found the one labeled Ravalli County Races 146.880 PL 100.0, a familiar frequency from when volunteer emergency nets ran during storm season. I took my handheld transceiver from the pack. It was a dual-band VHF and UHF unit with a long whip antenna and a battery pack I never let below half. I turned it to the repeater input, 146 MHz. I keyed up and spoke into my hand mic with words shaped by routines that had meaning again. "This is K7JRS, Portable Ward Mountain," I said. "Testing. Is anyone monitoring?" The repeater caught and retransmitted. My handheld's S-meter hit full bars on receive. The empty valley returned my own voice back to me over the tower speaker. The speaker was a tinny little thing meant for technicians. I heard my voice once, then the small echo you always get between direct and repeating path. Then silence. I gave it a few seconds. K7, JRS Portable Ward Mountain. This will be a periodic broadcast location until further notice. If you can hear this, I will transmit nightly at 9 o'clock, local time. I will read out safe routes, water sources, and anything I learn about movement patterns. If you are in trouble and can transmit, key up and call with your location and a simple description of the problem. Keep it short. If you cannot transmit, keep your radio on scan for nets. Stay away from continuous sound and vibration. Secure loose metal panels. Do not run engines in the open unless absolutely necessary. More tonight at 9 o'clock. K7 JRS clear. I lowered the handheld. The sound I had just released would bounce around the valley for a few microseconds and then vanish. The generator hum filled the gap. I spent the rest of daylight in work mode. I inventoried the racks, labeled everything with kitchen tape and thick marker, and reset the trip on a feed that went to the outside light. I left that light off. I replaced the split rubber boot on the entry where the coax met the shelter wall with silicone tape I had saved for this. I walked 50 feet of fence line and tied shut a panel that flapped. I cut the loose chain that had been the source of a ringing I had heard last visit in the spring, but had not wanted to fix because I had not yet committed to the tower. Commitment now felt like the only plan that added up to survival. The day tank read just under 20 gallons. I ran the generator for 2 hours while I worked. Based on this model and load, about 3 to 4 kilowatts with the rack and lights and small fans moving air, the engine would burn around 1 liter per hour, a bit more under load and less at idle. The saddle tank outside, a galvanized rectangle with a manual fill cap and a faded 500 gallons stenciled under flaking paint, was 1/3 full by the stick I dipped. That gave me a working window. I would not run 24/7. I would run during daylight when I needed power, then around the nightly schedule. I would live within what the fuel allowed, and I would plan to extend that with a hand-start generator I could scavenge and tune for small loads, battery charging, a desk lamp, and a laptop that had become a map archive and a logbook. Before dark, I slid the shelter door closed and camouflaged the outside entry with a panel of tarred roofing felt I found rolled behind the generator housing. The beacon atop the tower was disconnected. I left it that way. There was no air traffic to warn, and a flashing red dot would act like a bell hung in the fog. 9 o'clock arrived cold. I sat at the small table where technicians once drank coffee and looked at printouts. The handheld was on the table with an external microphone, connected to the shelter's VHF antenna through a small duplexer that fed the repeater and the bench port. I had a paper map of the valley folded to show the trails and Forest Service roads. I had a notebook with notes from the last month. Movement patterns, places safe after dawn, places bad when the wind blew. I had a list of names I had heard since spring and the last date anyone had answered to them. At 9, I keyed up. "Good evening," I said. "This is K7 JRS Portable Ward Mountain. This will be a brief update. The river bridges at Bell Crossing and Florence are clear as of this afternoon. The bridge south of Victor has a jackknifed truck against the guardrail and is blocked to vehicles, but you can cross on foot on the downstream side if you are careful. The grocery store in Hamilton has been picked over. The storage cooler has shelf-stable items in the upper racks where people did not look. The well at the maintenance yard on Grantsdale Road has a hand pump. The supply is safe if you let the water run until it clears. Do not linger by the chain link where the wind makes the fence sing. Movement there has been heavy because the hum carries. If you need shelter tonight, The maintenance shed by the sand pile is locked, but the door in back has a hinge pin missing. You can lift and swing. There's a first aid kit inside the orange cabinet. If you move by vehicle, secure any loose ladders or panels. Continuous rattles draw attention. If you are alone, you are not the only one listening. Keep transmission short. If you decide to share your location, do it in a way that lets you move after. I will be here again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. K7 JRS clear. I released the microphone. My voice came back a heartbeat later from the tower speaker because I left it on quietly to confirm the repeater behaved. Then came a second voice. "Copy," the second voice said. It was my voice. It repeated the last sentence I had spoken. Then the speaker went quiet. I froze with my hand still close to the microphone and listened for the texture under the word. How it rode over static. It was not a simple, local echo. It was not the fractional delay you hear when you speak through your own repeater. It was a longer delay, perhaps 1 second, with a faint ripple under it that sounded like multipath over distance or a second repeater in the chain. I reached for paper and wrote, "Reflection? Link?" Then I switched the handheld to monitor and stepped to the open door for a clean listen. There was nothing more. Pine branches pressed the sky. In the distance, a dog barked once and stopped. The tower line sang faintly in a light wind. The generator idled with steady tone. I waited 5 minutes, then another 5. Nothing else happened. I shut the door, drew the bolt, and sat back down. I made myself finish the routine. I shut the repeater down for the night to conserve fuel. The shelter went quiet. I let the generator run 10 more minutes, cool down, and shut it down too. In the sudden silence, I heard one last thing, a small tap on the tower, like a foot placed lightly on a ladder rung to test it. I did not sleep much. When the wind hit the guy wires just right, the tower whispered. I learned the pattern. I kept the pistol I'd brought, 9mm with standard magazines, close, but not in my hand. I am not a soldier and have never wanted to be one. I have hunted deer and elk and learned to move carefully in dark woods. I had walked away from the first weeks with a simple rule. Keep to daylight, avoid open areas, avoid continuous sound, and do not run unless you must. In the morning, I walked the road down to the switchback and then further to the creek. I filled bottles and carried them in a small frame pack. I came back by the long way around the ridge where I could see the valley and the smaller side roads. On the far side of a meadow, I saw a figure. The figure saw me. We both stopped. The figure was far enough that I could not tell whether they swayed because of wind or because of the stiffness of someone unwell. I raised my left hand palm out, then pointed to the far line of trees to show my intention to go that way. The figure did nothing. I used the long path through boulders and came up behind the shelter, keeping a rock between me and the meadow until I was inside with the door latched. I did not run. I kept the generator off through the day. I opened the battery cabinet and connected the charger to the generator circuits so it would engage when I ran it at night. I tested a direct line I had found that could feed a single receptacle for small tools when the generator was off. It was not live. I left it that way and made a note to trace it when I had more time. I greased the door hinges because squeaks carry. I taped the clamp on the air intake hose of the generator because it rattled against its bracket. Each small noise felt like a flare in an open field. At 9 that night, I brought the generator back up and gave the evening briefing. I did not mention the echo voice. I wanted to see if it would happen again without prompting. I kept my voice the same. Calm, simple sentences, useful specifics. I said where to find water in a place that everyone forgets. The pressure tanks at the closed school behind the maintenance closet. I said how to drain an office building fire suppression system without setting off a bell. The ball valve on a riser behind a panel that looks like it is not meant to be opened. I said that if anyone was listening east of Victor, the foothill road had a landslide that had left a passable lane only for small vehicles. When I paused, the echo returned. "Copy," it said, again with my voice. Same cadence, same timbre. The delay was slightly longer, maybe a second and a half. I turned the bench speaker down and used the handheld with the squelch open, listening for a link signal under the voice. I thought I heard a carrier that was not mine. "Ward Mountain. Say again the part about the school," a new voice said. It was not mine, or a reflection of mine. It was a woman's voice, clear and direct, with the slight tightness of someone trying to sound steady after days of not wanting to speak at all. "Go ahead," I said. "The pressure tanks. Back of the maintenance closet. You will need a flashlight." "We have children," she said. She gave a name and then said carefully, "We will be there in the morning at 8 o'clock. We are on the east side. The road is not safe for vehicles. We will move on foot." She did not give a street. She did not give a house. I did not ask her to. "Understood," I said. "Move slow. Avoid loose metal. Bring 2 containers per person, and do not set them down near a chain-link fence if the wind is up." There was a pause, and in it came my voice again, the fake one, saying "understood" a moment after I said it. The woman on the frequency made a small sound like a breath held and let go. "Who is that?" she asked. "Not sure yet," I said. "Might be a repeater link. Might be someone who thinks it is a good joke. Move at 8. I will watch the road near the school. If you need to call me, do it on the input frequency and I will hear you even if no one else does." "Okay," she said. "Thank you." She paused as though tasting the words and deciding to commit to them. "Thank you," she said again. Then she was gone. I shut down the repeater and the generator and sat in the dark, letting my eyes adjust and letting the wind's texture pick out the small changes in the night. I ate a small meal by headlamp and marked the fuel level on my stick. I closed the notebook. I laid down on the narrow technician cot I had set up under the small window and slept in increments. At dawn, I took the field glasses to the ridge. The school sat on the edge of the trees, a low building with a flat roof and a small flagpole where no flag moved. The parking lot had a bus at one end with weeds grown around the front bumper. I watched the road that led to it. At 8 o'clock, I saw 3 figures in a small file. An adult with a backpack, another adult, and a shorter figure in a hooded jacket with a small pack. The adults moved like people who had learned to keep the soles of their shoes close to the ground and avoid kicking loose gravel. They went to the maintenance door. The first adult slid something into the gap, maybe a piece of wire, to trip the latch. The door opened inward. They disappeared inside. At 8:20, they emerged. Each adult carried 2 5-liter containers. The child had one. They set down the containers in the grass and rested for 10 seconds. The adult touched the top of the child's hood, not a caress, just a counting of heads and an inventory of shape. Then they picked up the containers and moved along the line of shrubs, not the open lot. Movement near the far fence made me adjust the focus. 2 figures had come from the tree line on the east, slow and off balance in the way I had learned to recognize and not describe. The adult saw them. The adult put a hand on the child's shoulder and changed direction to pass behind the bus. From my vantage point, I saw a piece of sheet metal on the side of the bus flex and rattle in the rising breeze. It made a sound like a muted drumhead. The 2 figures that had come from the trees turned toward that sound. The adults froze. The child looked from one adult to the other. The sheet metal rattled again. I put the handheld to my mouth and keyed the input frequency so the repeater did not transmit. "Ward Mountain here," I said. "Move when the wind gusts. The sound will mask you. Do not let the container handles knock against each other." Copy, the woman's voice said. No delay now. On the ridge, I watched the leaves move and counted under my breath, learning the gust pattern. The adults moved when the bus panel rattled, one smooth step at a time, the child following with the same quiet intent. The two figures angled toward the panel as though following a steady beat. The adults made the corner of the building, and then the timing was lost to me behind the roofline. I counted the beats anyway. At a slower gust, they came out near the service driveway and crossed, low and smooth. No container clanked. They made the trees and were gone. I let out a breath and listened to the pines overhead. Thank you, the woman's voice said, soft now. We heard you at 9 o'clock last night. We could not believe a voice that did not sound like someone talking in a room to no one. You are not alone, I said. If you want to talk, do it at 9 tonight. We will. The radio went quiet. The ridge wind changed direction. I returned to the shelter and made a line item in my notebook. Containers, carry with cloth between handles, wind gusts as cover. Bus panel at school will continue to draw attention until secured. I added a plan to secure that panel if I could justify the trip for other tasks. I did not move without stacking reasons. 2 nights later, the echo came back at the end of my routine. I was reading out a tip about vibration in window blinds. If left loose, the slats made a steady sound that attracted movement, and giving a reminder about water at the school and the maintenance yard when I heard my own voice again. Copy, my voice said after a longer delay and without the noise of a weak link under it. The recording, the mimic, had improved. It now matched the tiny pauses I took while I glanced at notes, as though someone had recorded me and laid my own words back on top of each other with small changes in gap. The hair on my forearms lifted with the sensation you get when a pattern you thought was random lines up. I stayed calm. I measured the silence that followed. I waited until I would have stopped anyway. Then I keyed the handheld and spoke into the mic with steady tone. If you are retransmitting me on purpose, I would like to talk. If you want to speak but do not want to give your position, do it at 9 o'clock exactly. Key your microphone 3 times with 1-second gaps. I will listen. The generator hummed. The fan in the rack clicked and came on. The seconds stretched. I was about to release the key when the speaker clicked. 1, 2, 3 clicks spaced evenly. Not a repeater tail, a human count. This is K7JRS, I said, making my words neutral. Go ahead. The voice that came was quiet. A male voice with a scar of static over it, but real, not a recording. I was testing, he said, linking a small recorder to a low-powered transmitter to see if I could bounce your words from a hill to a street below. People in the low ground cannot hear you. The valley is not even. I was adding an echo link. That is good work, I said. The delay makes it sound like an imitation. It is also drawing attention. When you transmit, you make another sound source. Are you safe? No more or less safe than anyone, he said. I am west of Highway 93. The hill I am on is an old logging landing. I put a vertical antenna on a fiberglass mast in the bed of a truck so I can push it down if I need to. I am using a small voice recorder and a push-to-talk relay on a timer. Can you make the volume lower? I asked. People near sources of a continuous sound react. We can use your relay to reach areas that cannot hear me if we do the timing right, but we need to choose the moments. I can do that, he said. I can also move it. What is your call sign? I asked. KE7 my C, he said after a pause, as though trying on a name not used in a long time. I do not know if I still get to use it. You do, I said. Names help. I am James. K7JRS. He let out a breath that I heard on the carrier even as the repeater clipped some of it. James, he said. I have one more thing. There's a group near the sand piles. They hear you. They're not as careful as the woman with the child. They like engines and like to ride them fast. They will start their truck and let it idle while they argue about directions. They have drawn attention to that place. If you are telling people about the hand pump, tell them to stay out of sight from the road. There were 6 of those others there this morning." "I will," I said. We established a simple pattern. He would run his echo link only at the end of my evening brief, at lower power and with a delay we had agreed on so people would not confuse the echo with me speaking a second time. He would choose spots where he could set the mast, trigger the relay, and then shut down fast if he heard anything moving with intention. He moved every other night, sometimes more. He kept his voice calm and never told me exactly where he was. I did not press him. He told me when there were bad places, like a bend in the river where wind gathered and turned the reed beds into a continuous instrument, drawing movement like a bell, and when there were places that worked, a parking garage entrance with a rolling door you could pull down behind you and a concrete wall that made a good backstop without sounding like a drum. I kept the tower alive. I learned its tone in the wind and what that tone meant about the weather. I ran the generator as little as needed. I learned that at night when I sat very still, the steel lattice vibrated under certain gusts and set up a pattern that a person 40 yards off might mistake for a footstep. I taped small splits in the shelter vents. I replaced a loose fan in the rack with one scavenged from a desktop computer. I labeled the ladder with yellow tape so I could run it in the dark without looking and not kick a rung. Small things mattered when small things were the only things you could fully control. I did not like to go down into the valley unless I had more than one job to do. When I did not have to go, I stayed on the ridge and used the radios like a stethoscope against the skin of the valley. I listened to voices when they appeared, and I listened to the silences between them. There was the woman and the child, who became a family with a name I used only on paper. There was a man near the small airport who had access to hangars and told me when fuel trucks had enough in the bottom to pull with a hand pump. There was a retired nurse who had been on a home oxygen service who knew where cylinders were stored and how to ferry one at a time without drawing attention. Strap, dolly, quiet hands, slow walking. There were drivers who moved at dawn in low gear and idled less than 30 seconds. There were others who wanted to test machines and rev them. Some of those voices stopped. The first time the tower shook in a way that did not match the wind, I had just ended the 9 o'clock briefing and was closing my notebook. The generator was off. I was running on battery for the rack alone, light out, headlamp on low. The guy wire sang in a new key, deeper and steadier than the irregular note the wind produces, and the ladder took on a small periodic tremor. It took me a moment to separate it from the normal winter creaks. When I did, I went to the narrow window and looked up. The beacon was dark. The stars were steady. The ladder rungs vibrated again, in a set of 3 separated by 5 seconds, as if weight had been placed and removed on purpose. I moved to the equipment rack and pulled the bench radio volume down. Sounds carry. I slid the metal latch of the door quietly and pushed the door outward a finger width. I let cold air touch my cheek. The night smelled like resin and the cold metal of tools. I did not use a light. I waited long enough that the natural sounds rebuilt. Breeze, tiny pebbles shifting on the roof, a branch rubbing bark against bark. Then I heard a faint scrape against steel above the door. I closed the door gently and pulled the bolt. I stood still with both hands on the doorknob and my ear turned to the metal. The scrape came again. A second scrape. Then the faint thump of a foot placed on a rung and tested. I had secured the ladder with a steel hasp and a chain earlier in the week. It was meant to keep idle hands from climbing. People who did not think about vibration would shake it and leave. People who did think would not. The purpose of the chain was to make a small chime that would tell me when someone meant to climb. The chain did not chime. The foot that moved above me did so carefully and set weight down slowly. The person above me had practice with ladders, or the thing above me had learned by copying the sound that did not draw attention. I kept my headlamp off and moved by touch to the workbench, lifted the small pry bar from its place on the pegboard, and set it near the door. I was not going to open the door. I was going to listen. 3 steps went up the ladder. Then 3 steps went down. 5 seconds passed, another set of 3 up. I pictured a figure on the steel facing inward, testing the pattern of the rungs. The tower is not a single ladder, but ladder sections that rotate 90 degrees around the legs every platform. Some steps go slightly farther than a human expects. Some require you to lean back. The pattern being tested matched what I would do if I were learning the rhythm of a particular section by feel. I waited without moving a muscle. The testing stopped. The tower vibrated in normal wind for a long minute. Then I heard a small click, like 2 teeth touching, and then nothing. At 9 the next night I kept my voice steady and my update short. At the end, before shutting down, I keyed the handheld and spoke normally. "This is K7JRS. I am receiving a new mechanical sound at the tower at night. If you are near the ridge and you are testing climbs in the dark, I will be inside the shelter. Please announce yourself first. If you are not a person and you are climbing by imitation, know that ladders are not safe for you. The rungs cut feet, and the heights do not forgive missteps. If you are a person who wants to come in, knock 3 times at ground level on the door. If you do not knock 3 times, I will assume you are not a visitor." I ended the broadcast. Silence returned. For a long time, there was nothing new. 2 nights later, when I finished the update and set the handheld down, the bench speaker clicked, and I heard the yard outside in my ears. A side-tone reflection from a handheld microphone close to my door. A male voice said, 3 knocks, not on the air but quietly on the metal door. 3 knocks followed, spaced even, soft but firm. "KE7, M. Ike," the man's voice said after a beat, now on the air as well. "I am at your door. I think we should talk in person." I stood and placed my hand on the bolt. I looked at the fan on the rack and listened to its bearings. I looked at the tiny clock on the bench that I had not used since being here. The clock said 9:18. I took the pry bar in my other hand and slid the bolt. I opened the door inches. Cold air came in. The man outside was at least a decade older than me, clean-shaven, with hair cut short with scissors. He wore a pack and had his handheld clipped high on his chest with a long cord to the speaker mic. He kept his hands where I could see them and looked at my face once, and then at the hinges, and then at the ground. His eyes were clear. He had a quietness about him that fit the way he had built the Echo Link. "I had to come up and show you something," he said quietly. "It will be fast. May I come in?" "You may," I said. "Do not touch anything that rattles." He stepped in, like someone who had done time in workshops and knew that every tool has its place and that you should not put your fingers where someone else expects a sharp thing to live. I closed the door and pushed the bolt. He took a small recorder from a chest pocket and set it on the bench. He pressed play. I heard my voice say, "If you are a person who wants to come in, knock 3 times at ground level." Then I heard another voice layered underneath, a voice that sounded like gravel poured slowly, repeating what I had said but with small mismatches in timing. The mismatch was not random. It matched the pattern I had invented when I talked about the gust timing in the schoolyard. The echo voice had learned my pause length and applied it to new sentences. It was a little faster this time, like a recording set at a 1.1 speed. "I recorded this last night from a hill near the old quarry," he said. "I was not the one transmitting. There's another transmitter. It is not strong, and it is not on your repeater. It is low and near that quarry hill. The copy quality is poor. It fades. But it is there." "How sure?" I asked. "Sure enough to walk here," he said with a small smile. "I could be wrong. But if I'm not wrong, then you have someone copying you." "Or something," I said. He nodded once, like he had already had that conversation with himself, and did not like either branch. "If it is someone," he said, "they are playing a game that is not helpful. If it is something, it has learned the timing of your cadence. It is acting like a recorder and a bad speaker. It is enough to draw attention." "Can you show me?" I asked. He nodded and took a folded topo map from his pack. Paper, with a crease pattern that said it had lived in that pocket for weeks. He unfolded it on the bench and used a pencil to mark his hill and draw a circle for a very rough bearing. We both bent over the pencil line the way radio people always end up bending over paper, even if they can imagine it without drawing. He drew a second line. The lines crossed on the quarry hill southeast of the maintenance yard. A road, now cracked and overgrown, climbed in switchbacks to a flat bench where a rock had been cut. Trees had grown in the spaces. The bench had a single piece of equipment left under a tarp that had shredded into flags. "Could be a small kid's walkie," he said. "The range matches. Could be a handheld set on low power with a bad battery. Could be a handheld taped to a fence with the button held down. Could be something that hears a pattern and repeats it." "I will go in daylight," I said. "I will go when wind is moving." "I will go," he said. "I am closer, and I'm already making noise. If someone is watching for me, they have already marked my shape." I shook my head. "You are useful where you are," I said. "You are the echo we can control. I will do this. You can be my voice if I do not return by night." He looked at my face and then at the map and then at his hands. "You have a plan," he said, "not a question." "Yes," I said. "It involves cloth strips and small nails and a little glue, and a long stick." We went in the morning. We did not go together. He returned to his truckmass job. I approached from the ridge side with the long stick broken from a deadfall and the cloth and the small nails in a bag. The road up to the quarry had small rocks and large weeds. I moved slow. I stopped twice and listened a long time. At the bench, I found the tarp piece he had marked and a scrap of a pallet underneath. I found no handheld taped to a fence. I found no obvious speaker. I did find a steel plate on the side of a small shed that faced the valley and a metal vent pipe that passed through it. The plate had loosened from rusted screws and flexed when the wind hit the shed. The pipe made the shed a resonator. The plate became a membrane. When wind gusted and the plate flexed, it made a tone. The tone was in the register of a voice and had harmonics that sounded like a sentence spoken by someone with a sore throat. It did not say words. But if you were below on the road and you were afraid and tired and you heard the plate, and you were thinking of voices because you had heard me at 9 o'clock every night, you might think it was speech. You might repeat the pattern you thought you heard. I set down the pack and worked. I put a small bead of glue under the plate. I pushed a thin strip of cloth between the plate and the shed to damp the vibration. I put 2 small nails in with a light tap, just enough to keep the plate from flexing as one. The wind changed. The plate stopped singing. The shed turned quiet. The valley below lost one voice. I stayed long enough to be sure. Then I walked the far path home, the one that hugged the ridge. Halfway back, I saw the outline of someone on a lower spur. Broad shoulders, hands empty, moving with purpose but without rush. They noticed me. They rested against a pine trunk and let me pass behind them. They were not the quick kind. They were the quiet kind. I breathed out without sound and kept walking. That night at 9, I gave the update. I added a small field fix about metal plates on sheds. If a plate is loose, it will sing in the wind, I said. It is a false voice. If you hear a voice near a shed and there is a wind, put a piece of cloth between the plate and the frame. Use a small nail. Use glue if you have it. You will make the world one sound quieter. I paused, and in the pause my own voice did not return. The echo link was silent because KE7 Myc had not keyed it. He did not need to. The voice we could not control was gone. The days became a pattern of keeping things steady. I mapped water sources and wrote them in block letters on the paper chart near the door so I could read them by touch in the dark. I kept the generator used only when needed and ran the charger in bulk and absorption, and then shut it down before it hit float so I did not waste fuel. I opened and closed the battery cabinet to listen to the health of the cells. A healthy battery makes a sound when you touch it with a knuckle that is different from a bad one. I secured loose panels at the school bus and returned at midday to check. The rattle did not return. I made a small notice board at the base of the tower inside the fence, a plastic sheet with slots and weather strips where I could leave printouts of the nightly briefings. I included the date, November 10, and the next day's date, November 11, so people could hold time in their head again. The woman with the child began to check in every third night. She shared only what she chose to, which I respected. She talked about keeping shoes dry and how to cross irrigation ditches without splashing by laying a plank and using your hands in the grass. She told me where trash can lids rattled in a side alley and how to wedge them. She told me how many times she'd had to stop an older boy from testing snowbanks with a stick on a day with wind because the continuous tapping upset what lived in the trees near the road. Tell people that tapping is like a bell to them, she said. We forget that sometimes. I will, I said. Sometimes in the middle of a sentence I would hear my own words in my ears and think of the night when the echo voice came. And the tower shook, not because of wind but because of intention. It kept me careful. In December, the cold deepened and the days narrowed to a slit. I drew fuel off the lower part of the tank and added a small dose of anti-gel. I cleaned the air filter element with light breath, not compressed air that would make noise. I set a low-temperature alarm from a simple mechanical bell in case the battery cabinet dropped below freezing. I used the rack only when people were likely to call. The sky lowered and the hill got quieter. Snow came with the kind of still air that lets you hear far. The tower became part of the weather, and I let my body learn the new notes it made. One night when the snow had been falling all day and I had left the generator off to save fuel, the bench radio lit with a carrier and a voice I did not recognize said my call sign. Ward Mountain, the voice said. This is a group from the north. We have a child with a high fever and a cough. We have a thermometer and one course of antibiotics that may not be right. We have clean water. We do not want to come near the tower because we do not want to bring trouble. But if there is a nurse who hears you, we could use advice. I keyed up. Understood, I said. Stand by 1 minute. I did not have a nurse with me, but I had a list of names and nights. I called the retired nurse. She did not answer. I relayed the message in general and asked anyone with medical training to come to the input frequency and say hello. I waited 1 minute. I waited 2. KE7. MIC came up on the input and said, I have a second handheld on a second battery. I will go to a high point and listen on the wider scan. If I hear anyone with medical training, I will bring them to you. Thank you, I said. Keep it short. The woman with the child came up next. I have a thermometer, she said. I have children. I am not a nurse. But I can share what I know. Put them on. The voice from the north and the woman from the east spoke on the input frequency while I kept time and kept them from talking over each other. They spoke in simple sentences. They gave numbers. They kept everything plain and without drama. I did not need to tell them to avoid words that make people stop listening. They had learned that language can calm a room. They made a plan for cool cloths and fluid. They made a plan to keep the child warm without sweating. They made a plan to call back in 2 hours. In that 2 hours, I sat by the door with my coat on and listened to the tower. The snow turned to tiny ice in the wind and made the guy wires hiss. I remembered the first day when I turned the generator over and the equipment rack went from dead to green. I remembered the clipboard with the technician's initials. I pictured that technician running the monthly test with a coffee cup and a comfortable expectation that the grid would come back after an outage. I felt a kind of gratitude that I could not put into a sentence and would not try to. The child's fever came down. The group from the north said thank you. The woman said, "You do not owe us anything," and made it sound like a simple instruction. The echo did not come. The hill remained quiet except for the things we could not control: wind, snow, and the millimeter movements of steel buried in rock. The first attempt to take the shelter came on a clear day in January when the sun was out and the river steam rose against the cold. 3 people came up the service road in daylight, walking 2 apart, one behind, wearing jackets with the same brand logo you get at a feed store. They walked with intent. They stopped by the fence and spoke politely, in the way of people who have prepared to speak politely until they do not need to be polite anymore. They said they wanted to use the generator for a project and that they would leave me enough to run my announcements. They did not say what the project was. When I said no, they asked what I thought was fair rent. When I said I did not rent this place, they turned to conference, and in the adjustment of shoulders and the small open of a stance, the way you move when you are about to go from conversation to the next thing, I saw the plan. 2 would go to the fence post where the chain link was weak. 1 would talk. The one who talked had a pry bar under his jacket. I did not raise my voice. I did not move my hands fast. I told them the generator ran on diesel and that the lower part of the tank was almost gelled, and that even if they got inside, they would not be able to start it without heating the lines, and that if they pulled on the fence, the post would rattle and draw movement from the tree line because there was a piece of metal there that I had not had time to secure. I gave them simple facts the way you speak to someone who has not planned for the actual work of a thing. I did not use words that would escalate. They looked at the fence post, and the one with the pry bar under his jacket looked back at the trees and measured the risk they had not anticipated. He put his hands in front of his body and rubbed them together as if cold and laughed once, like a man in a feed store. He nodded and stepped back. They went down the road. I watched them throw small rocks into the brush at the first switchback, testing for movement. It was not a bad habit, it just made a sound that carried. I did not see them again, but I kept their description in my book. In February, I pulled a long coax run that had UV damage off the tower and replaced a section with a length I had salvaged from a building downtown. I put new heat shrink over the connectors and covered the whole bend with self-sealing tape. I replaced a ground lug with one I crimped and soldered. I took readings with the multimeter and wrote them down in a clean column that made sense when I read it a week later. I adjusted the guy wire tension when the temperature rose and fell and the steel changed length. I ate small meals and kept the shelter swept. I took the pistol apart and cleaned it, even though I hoped never to use it. I slept on the cot and dreamed ordinary dreams about folding laundry. In March, 2 voices I had never heard before called in from near Florence to say that a bridge that had been clear was now bad because of a small landslide, and because someone had tried to drive a heavy truck over the remaining lane and broken the edge. I updated the nightly briefing to reflect that. The woman called in to say her child had learned to move quiet. The retired nurse came back on the air after a week off and said she had secured a small space with a metal door that did not rattle. She sounded tired, but steady. KE7. Mike moved his echo link to a new spot and ran it for 10 seconds at the end of the night. He kept his habit of checking in only when needed, and I did not ask where he slept. We had an agreement that was like a wire strung between 2 points, tight enough to carry a signal, loose enough not to snap in wind. In April, the valley woke. Meltwater ran. The smell of wet dirt replaced the smell of frozen air. The tower made new sounds as it warmed. I went over every bolt I could reach at low anchor level and checked torque with an old iron wrench I had found under the workbench. I replaced a missing cotter pin with a bent nail that I peened at the end so it could not slip. The maintenance that had been done annually by people with clipboards was now done daily by me. I found comfort in it, not because it was a ritual, but because it kept the shape of the tower in my head. And when its shape stayed known, the rest of the valley stayed within the circle where I could imagine it. On a warm evening in late April, after a day when the wind barely moved and the valley had been the quietest I had heard it in months, a new voice came on the air. It was the polite voice of a person who had sat near a radio for a long time to learn how other people spoke before speaking themselves. "Ward Mountain," he said. "This is a person on the ridge west of Corvallis. I hear your voice every night. We have a place where the fence sings. We do not like it. We can secure it if we have a tool. We do not have a tool. We have food and a place to sleep that is dry. Would you trade a tool for information about a route that no one has used for months because they do not know it exists?" "What tool do you need?" I asked. "A wrench," he said, "a big one. The kind that turns nuts that hold wire. The nuts are square. Our small pliers are not good." "I have one," I said. "I had 2. Tell me about the route." He did not answer directly. "I will show you," he said. "Tomorrow at noon, Old Orchard Road. I will leave a flag by the ditch to show which way to turn. It will be a strip of blue cloth. If you do not see me, leave the wrench near the flag and go." "I prefer to see you," I said. "Blue flag, noon." "Blue flag," he said, "noon." He signed off using no name at all. I put the wrench in a bag and set the bag near the door. I slept badly. In the morning I walked the ridge path, then the contour trail that kept me out of the bottoms and out of line of sight to long straight roads. At the Orchard Road, a dirt track bordered by wild apple that had gone to brush, the blue flag was there, tied to a sapling. The person was there too, standing 15 yards off against a trunk with his hands in view. He looked like someone who had worked outside. His hands had not gotten soft. He watched me walk up and watched me stop 5 yards away, and waited until I set the wrench on the ground and stepped back. "Thank you," he said, picking it up. He moved to the fence and tightened a square nut with economy, no show. The singing section went quiet. He left a second strip of blue cloth hanging where I could see it and gestured with his head. We walked 100 yards along a low ditch that paralleled the road, then turned through brush to a trail I had not walked. Old, narrow, and quiet, running behind a row of backyards and then into a gash in the low hillside. The gash took us to a wooden culvert under a private drive that had no house at the end anymore. We came out near a shed with a pickup truck that had 4 flat tires and a bed full of broken tile. We went beyond the shed and found a footpath along a pipeline right-of-way that curved into a stand of fir and poplar, and then a narrow plank bridge over a swale where frogs called. The whole path kept you in the quiet places. The route took 20 minutes off a walk that would have taken an hour on the road. He had given me something worth a wrench. "Good," I said, meaning both the path and the exchange. "Good," he echoed. "What is your name?" I asked. "David," he said. "My wife is Sarah. We grew up here. We were going to leave and then decided we know too much about this place to leave. That is what we have as an advantage." "James," I said. "We know," he said with a small smile that did not carry mockery. "Everyone knows the voice." News ran on feet in the valley and on a small number of radios. People began to leave small notes in the weatherboard at the base of the tower with penciled dates. Some were simple. Water's still clean at ditch behind old mill. Some were offers of exchange. 2 gallons diesel for 2 gallons water. Leave at yellow propane tank at the barn on the Ridge Road. We'll check at noon and at 3. Some were small human things that were not wasteful. Found a red mitten near the bus at the school, left it on the seat. I read those aloud at 9 o'clock with the same tone I used for bridges and pumps. I learned that in a place where you have rules to help everyone live, you keep your voice even for the small things. In May, the generator began to start harder. The glow plugs took longer. I cleaned terminals, checked the ground strap, and used a small propane heater for a brief preheat on cold mornings, careful to vent and careful not to make a continuous hiss the wind would carry. I changed oil with the last of the 5-gallon pail from the maintenance yard and a filter cross-referenced to this model. I saved the drained oil in jugs because oil becomes something else when you need it to. I wrote the hours on the wall by the door with a black marker in neat tens. I calculated fuel burn and left myself a margin on paper that I would not burn under. Through it all, the nightly briefings continued. They were not stories. They were lists of useful facts that I took care to verify. They were dates and bridges and pumps and fence lines to secure. They were the names of people who wanted to share and the absence of the names of people who did not. They were reminders to keep engines off, to keep shoes dry, to carry cloth to quiet handles and buckles, to check bolts on ladders and not climb at night unless you had to. They were a way to make the valley into a single room again where people could clear their throats and say what they had to say without shaking the walls. One night in early June, after a day of thunderheads building over the mountains and moving east, I ended the briefing and heard a sound in the tower that was not wind, not the small shifts of steel in heat, not the testing of rungs by feet. It was a low hum, steady and constant, that came from the base, where a small box I had not paid attention to earlier sat on a frame near the ground rod. The box had a cracked label, Beacon Controller. I crouched and put my hand near it. It vibrated. I had left the beacon disconnected. The controller had decided to test itself, to run for an interval set long ago in someone's setup process, and its test produced a steady hum in a lower range than the wire song. The hum transmitted into the ladder and up the legs and into the air where it became a sound that carried farther than a voice. I shut the controller off at the small toggle. The hum stopped. The tower went still. The night outside was just the night again. I added one more line to the list I read that night, and it was this: if you control anything that makes a steady sound, test all modes of it, even the ones you do not think will come on. Controllers have their own minds. In July, when the grass had gone to seed and I had settled into the habit of measuring the tank with a stick in the morning and the evening, when I'd replaced the last of the cracked coax boots and had added a second ground rod in parallel with the first, driven into shallow bedrock with sweat and patience, the echo returned. It was not the false echo. It was the human one. It came from the north, weak and clear at the same time. It came as my own words repeated at a lower volume, and then a second voice overlaid, "This is KE7 Myci. James, your voice is reaching the low ground tonight. There's a front moving, and the air is doing things with radio I like. I am not running the link. The valley is carrying you. I wanted you to know." "Thank you," I said. "We will use it." We used it. The low ground heard me without help for a week. I heard new voices from places that had been quiet. People who had been living in basements and garages and thought the world had shrunk to the size of the block. We added their facts to the list. We added their small human things. Then the air changed and the help of the weather went away. We went back to work. When autumn returned, I'd been at the tower for a year. I knew every creak and bolt. I knew how the wind in the pines became a hiss in the guy wires and how that hiss put a small edge on the shelter door. I knew how long it took to heat oil in winter with an old stove in a safe manner and pour it without making a mess. I knew how to move the ladder chain so it did not clink, but still told me if a human foot touched a rung. I knew the names of 20 people who survived because they learned to avoid steady sound and mechanical music. I knew my own voice and how to keep it steady. On the day, I realized the day tank had reached the mark I had set as the line I would not cross, the line beyond which I would not keep the generator as a daily tool. I read the update at 9 o'clock, then added one more item, my voice plain. "This is K7JRS, I said. "Tonight is the last night I will run the generator for the nightly briefing as a matter of course. The fuel level is at the planned limit. Starting tomorrow, I will run on batteries and sunlight for as long as the weather allows, and I will start the generator only when necessary. The briefing will continue at 9 o'clock. The signal may be weaker. Those who can relay, relay. Those with routes for runners, share them. If you have a written note for someone, leave it at the base of the tower behind the south post. I will check at dawn and at noon. If you need help, call. If you are alone, you are not the only one listening." I let the carrier drop and listened to the healing silence of a machine shutting off, not because it failed, but because I had chosen. The echo returned once, in the human voice this time. "Copy," KE7 Mike said. "We hear you." The woman's voice came a moment later. "We will listen the way we always have," she said. "Speak the way you always have." "I will," I said. I stood and went to the switch. I let the generator run cool for a full minute because machines do not care about speech but do care about the way they are treated. Then I shut it down and put my hand flat on the housing to feel it tick as it cooled. The tower went back to being a piece of the ridge, and I went back to being a person in a small room speaking to a valley at 9 o'clock. With a voice that had learned what to say and what to leave out. I slept in short stretches and woke to small movements, the way you do when you have a responsibility that tells time in minutes. I woke to the wind and to the tiny sound of mice who now stayed out of the equipment cabinet because I had sealed it and left them walnut shells on a far shelf where their chewing would not vibrate the cokes. I woke to a knock sometimes. 3 steady taps, then the voice of a person who had walked up the service road in daylight and wanted to say thank you in person and leave a small jar of screws or a pocketful of underused washers or a wrench they had no matching nut for. They would stand in the doorway with their hands where I could see them and look at the generator with the kind of respect you give a thing that has not failed you yet. I would nod. We would speak 5 minutes, they would leave. The valley slowly taught people how to be near each other again without shaking any walls. The tower never fell. It never shook more than a breath except when I needed to know it could. I never learned who the first echo voice maker had been, the one that laid my own words back with odd timing. I think now that it was a person who could not speak but wanted to, who had a device set to repeat and set it to do so from a hill that also had a singing plate. I secured the plate. The device ran its battery down and then became a piece of metal under leaves. Or maybe it was a person who thought a joke was a way to live and then learned the wind has its own sense of humor. I stayed until the batteries failed and the winter sun gave me too little. I stayed until the routine grew thin and needed more hands than mine. When I finally packed the handheld, the notebook, the markers, and the wrench, I left the board at the base with one last page under plastic. Nightly briefings at 9 o'clock will continue from the lower repeater site on the ridge west of Corvallis as weather and power permit. KE7, Mike will relay. If you know how to run a generator and a charger, and if you log numbers with care and keep bolts tight and ladders free of rattles, You can run this place. Use the stick to measure fuel. Use cloth to quiet any part that sings. Do not let anything make a steady sound if you can help it. Move in daylight. Speak in plain language. Sign with your name if you want, or with your call sign if you have one. If you cannot sign with either, you are still not alone. James, K7, JRS. I closed the shelter door and slid the bolt, not because it mattered, but because I had always done it. I touched generator housing once. I stepped into the wind and listened to the wires sing one last ordinary note. Then I walked the ridge path, the one that avoids the open places and keeps you in a quiet band between pine and rock. And I went down into the valley, where the roads that were once obvious had become the paths you choose only when you know what sings and what does not. I took the long way. I moved when the wind moved. I kept the radio on my chest and listened for the small voices that came at 9 o'clock. And the valley, which had learned a little about listening, kept answering back. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.